Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Kim, for being here. Kim has said a couple times in the last few minutes, well, we're the only thing that stands between them
That's right.
and the end of the day. And I might normally worry about that, but I have Kim Davis on my team, so I'm not worried about it at all. I'm delighted to be able to help bring her to you guys. I just asked the team backstage what they wanted us to dial up or dial down. Like, what would they like to add to our presentation? And in the deep wisdom of one of the second-year team members, he said, I want to know where the NHL is going to expand next.
And my response was, there are a lot of things I can be transparent about, but that's not one of them.
So, Kim, I've worked in sports analytics for a number of years now, and we've seen the world of sports analytics evolve. And some sports seem to evolve faster than others. Like, for example, baseball's way ahead of football, which is basketball's ahead of football probably. And we sometimes explain that by the game. Some games are simpler, more easily analyzed, like baseball. But we also say, well, it doesn't fully explain it because some sports like basketball seem to be ahead of similarly complicated sports like hockey. And we start saying things like, well, maybe the hockey culture is more conservative and not as open to change. That's kind of an outside hypothesis about the NHL culture. To what extent is that true, and to what extent does that give you a steep mountain to climb, or do I have it wrong? I might have it wrong. What's your impression? You've been there 6 or 7 years now.
Yeah. So I would say that hockey culture is very conservative, but I would also say that sports are very conservative, generally speaking. I think one of the challenges that we have in hockey is that we never toot our horn. I was shocked when I came to the NHL to find out about the progressive things that the NHL was doing and had been doing for a couple of decades. And when I would ask people about, why doesn't anyone know about all of this, the response would be, we're humble. We're quiet. We don't need to talk about it. And
what's an example of something?
So 27 years ago, the NHL started a program called Hockey is for Everyone. And it went into communities across North America to get growing demographics, literally thinking out, 3 decades, growing demographics involved in the sport. Nobody, even today, many people don't know about that initiative. Mm-hmm. It's 27 years old, mm-hmm. and it was before any other major sports league. Mm-hmm. The NHL was the first major sports league to take on cancer as a signature initiative, being the first in that. Mm-hmm. Nobody knows that. Mm-hmm. Now, we've just established a partnership with the V Foundation, and that is elevating our Hockey Fights Cancer initiative to new heights because of the relationship with the V Foundation. Mm-hmm. But that came as a result of some real innovative thinking. Mm-hmm. So, the list goes on, and I think there are a number of examples that do speak to the fact that we are quiet and humble, and I think the commissioner is finally understanding that you can be humble and not be quiet.
That's a nice combination.
Yeah.
What about how you got there? It's not obvious that you would be as senior as you are in the NHL. You've 20 to 30 years in banking ahead of time. Is that story an interesting story? And does that speak something about the NHL that they would hire you?
Well, it speaks to Commissioner Bettman and the kind of leader he is, which we typically don't see and hear from the media about him. His persona in the media is not the experience that I've had with him for the 7 years. For
those who don't know his persona, what would you say?
Well, he's a labor lawyer. He is a tough negotiator. He probably has the reputation of being arrogant, not necessarily, warm and fuzzy. Mm-hmm. That would not be the way he would be described. Mm-hmm. So that is his persona. Mm-hmm. The longest standing commissioner in the history of major sports, 31 years. Of the 32 leagues that are part of the NHL, 20 of those teams came in under his leadership. This says a lot about his influence and his power, right? So, yeah, I met Gary in 2017. I was a consultant, and I was leading the scope of work for the NHL. And I was supposed to interview 10 people. And every time I interviewed someone, they would go and tell the next person, you really need to talk to her. She's really asking some provocative questions. So what was supposed to be 10 ended up being 30 interviews that I did. And so the data that I collected, speaking of data analytics, the data that I collected suggested that the problem that they were asking me to solve was actually not the real problem. That there were some organizational design issues, there were some power and privilege issues, there were a lot of different issues that both spoke to analytics, spoke to the head, and spoke to the heart. And so I put all that together because I had done all this interviewing. And when I presented it to him, I'd given them the presentation ahead of time. And when I walked in his office, he closed the presentation in front of me. And the impression was, I don't really need to hear this. And my reaction was, well, we already got paid for this, so I'm saying it no matter what. And so I took my copy out, and I painstakingly walked him through every page of the data. And, you know, he's tough, but he's not rude, so he didn't stop me. And that was June of 2017. I got a call from the deputy commissioner at the end of August saying, the commissioner wants to talk to you. And I'm like, what commissioner? Like, you know, you're a consultant, like I'm on to the next thing. So I couldn't even remember what I had done, actually. And I met with him after Labor Day, and he said, I didn't like what you were telling me. He said, but I thought about it and I wrestled with it. That's the word he used. He said, I wrestled with it all summer. And I came to understand that I need you to help me. And that was transformative for me because I said, any leader that's willing to be that vulnerable is the kind of leader that I can work with. And I had no idea that he was actually interested in me joining the NHL, but over the next 3 months, he and I co-created the position that I have. We cobbled together some existing organizations in the NHL, and I created some new scopes, and 6 years later, here I am.
So it sounds like you've had a very strong commissioner on your side. You converted him sometime during the summer, and he's been on your side since then. But these professional sports leagues are mostly pretty loose affiliations. So you've got 32 relatively independent organizations. What's it been like for you to try to wrangle that group of owners and front offices and players, even if you do have a strong commissioner on your side?
Yeah, well, the first thing that's important in a federation like a sports organization is to understand the kind of power that the commissioner and the league has. And as I said before, 31 years, longest standing commissioner in all of major sports. 20 of the 32 teams that are part of the NHL came in under his leadership, so he has a fair amount of influence. He also leads the organization in a very integrated way. And I use that word because my observation in spending time with some of the other sports leagues is that they're not as integrated as the NHL is, meaning that all of his Board of Governors meetings, he really looks to build consensus. So I had that on my side because I had Gary as an advocate. That's a word that I know has been used over these 2 days. And so I was able to use his reflective light and his power and influence to at least get me in the door, right? And they were willing to hear what I had to say. And I opened my introduction to the owners with data. I started with data. So when I was at JP Morgan for over 2 decades, I had done a tremendous amount of work with Bill Fry at the Brookings Institute. And Bill had been collecting all of this longitudinal demographic data for the past 3 or 4 decades. And so as soon as I joined the NHL, I called Bill and said, can you take that demographic data and overlay the 31 markets that we have, because Seattle wasn't a market then, and tell me how we look relative to where demographics are going, and how does our current fan base look, and how does our future fan base look, the fans in waiting. And his initial analysis was stunning. 23 of the then 31 markets were already majority minority for millennials and Gen Zers. And we then overlaid to understand that for those 2 generational cohorts, they only represented about 3% of our current fan base. So we knew we had a significant amount of work to do to build credibility, and to build a strategy to get those fans and those fans in waiting. And then I went around and talked to every owner and president about the data. And that was important because you have to meet people where they live.
Was that sufficiently convincing for all 32? How was it? What differences did you see across the league, and how did you move through them?
Well, absolutely not. And you know, something that I learned when I was at JP Morgan, I'd spent 22 years at JP Morgan during the biggest merger and acquisition period in financial services. So during that period, I went through 15 mergers. You know, sometimes being the acquirer, sometimes being the acquiree. So what I learned quickly was how to pivot. And probably about a third of the clubs knew that this data was like on fire. They needed to act immediately, and that was great. I always believe you run with the horses that are ready to run. Often in change work, we try to convince everyone to be on board before we proceed. I don't think that's a winning strategy, particularly in sports, which is so competitive, and these owners are very competitive with each other. And so if I've got 13 clubs ready to go, we started running. We started putting strategies together. And then another 7 or 8 saw that, and they didn't want to get left behind. And so now you've got 20 out of 31. 32 comes on. Seattle's already on board because I've been cultivating that relationship. So now you've got, 9 or 10 clubs that don't get it. Still majority.
So this has mostly been talking about growing the league and the challenges that the NHL faces with the changing demographic and the concerns about growth long term. You also have DEI responsibilities. What is the connection between those two? How do you see the relation between the league's DEI work and the need for growth at the top level?
Well, one of the things I said to Gary when I joined was I don't want DEI anywhere in the title of my job. And if you look at my job title, it's not there. And in 40 years in industry, I've never had DEI in the title of my jobs.
Okay, why do you feel so strongly?
Well, I'm going to tell you. Because I think people have so many preconceived notions about what diversity, equity, and inclusion are, and it leads from their own sense of their personal experiences. And 30 years ago, I believed, and I believe it today, that inclusion and growth are synonymous. Let me say that again. Inclusion and growth are synonymous. Inclusion is not some extra, finger that we have that we activate when the others don't work. It is part of the DNA of how we grow our businesses. And if we focus on what we like or don't like about DEI, then we lose sight with the reality of what is going to be necessary for us to grow and thrive in the future. And that is the reality of what culture is going to look like, what it looks like today and what it's going to look like, and what people's expectations are going to be around what they want and what they are going to consume.
Can you make that concrete for us in terms of the NHL? What demographic trends are you specifically focused on, and what are the implications for NHL culture?
Well, so it's very hard to think about demographic trends without thinking about intersectionality, right? We all operate at various intersections. But I'll give you a concrete example. 40% of our current fan base are women. Who in here, if I had said that, would have thought that was the case? 40% of the NHL fan base are women today. Okay.
I wouldn't have.
Well, we've never had a marketing campaign that is focused on women. We have not had an intentional sponsorship strategy that focuses on women-led organizations or brands that promote women, right? All of which we are working on now. But the fact of the matter is that didn't just happen yesterday. We have been building that fan base, and women have played and enjoyed the sport of hockey for 3 decades. Mm-hmm. So I use the word intentionality a lot. I think that it is really, really important when you start talking about demographics and intersectionality that you use data intentionally to understand where your opportunities, but also where your threats are. Mm-hmm. And then you hone in and you begin to develop specific strategies, very concrete strategies around that. Another example, in Canada, the greatest growing population is the South Asian community, particularly in Western Canada, but it's also moving east. That required us to build relationships with influencers. It required us to get that community to see hockey as their game. Mm-hmm. That strategy was very different than the strategy we had to take with, for example, the African American community, which has been consuming the sport of hockey for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. The Colored Hockey League existed before the National Hockey League, 1895.
Is that right?
Some of the innovations of hockey came out of the Colored Hockey League. Very few people know about that, right? So with that community, it was convincing them that the sport was going to be welcoming to them versus South Asians. So these demographic strategies have to be very, very focused, they have to be intentional, and they have to be relevant. Mm-hmm.
What's the connection between those, essentially, this cheapens it a bit, but for convenience, marketing strategies and the organizational culture of the NHL and of the 32 individual teams, the internal culture? Yeah,
well, Billie Jean King says, you believe it if you see it. Mm-hmm. And so part of the culture of the 32 teams, and this is why we put a framework together for all the teams called the 7 Dimensions of Excellence in Inclusion. Mm-hmm. Starts with leadership, and again, a theme that I've heard over today. Nothing happens without a leader as an advocate. Mm-hmm. Education, if people don't have a baseline of understanding of where you are and where you're going, then you're probably going to get stuck somewhere along the way. So we put these 7 dimensions together, and one of the dimensions was employment. If we want to be reflective of the communities that we are in across North America, then those communities have to be reflected in our employee base. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So over the past 5 years, we've increased the population of women and people of color across our clubs by almost 4 times what it was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's, again, being intentional. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why is this important? Because often, I get quite a bit of hate mail from hockey traditionalists who don't understand why I'm focused on demographic shifts and looking to change the sport, as many will say. We're all changing and evolving. 20 years ago, I would not have imagined that my 2 grandsons would be black and Irish, right? But they are. Their father is from Ireland and their mother is African American. That's the world. And so culture and how people identify, and we're already seeing research today from Gen Alpha, that's, this population from 0 to 15, and how they're going to think about sport is going to be very different than even the 18-year-old today. Those are my grandkids. And so I want them to, if they want to play hockey, if they want to be a hockey fan, I want them to feel like it's welcoming. And I think that's the way we all have to think about it. If hockey is going to not just survive, but thrive, this is how we have to think about the business.
Okay, I want to put a call out to questions. We've got a handful of questions, but I'm going to try to take some of these as we go through the rest of our time together. So please send them in if you have something you're interested in. You mentioned receiving hate mail, Kim, and certainly at the league level, you've run into various controversies. Some people come out of the woodwork to resist some of these efforts. The Pride Night controversies from last year, for example. What have you learned about dealing with that kind of vociferous opposition? What have you learned from your own experience? There are those in the room here who might be battling some of these inclusion lines as well. So what advice or learnings do you have from that?
Well, you have to be fearless, and you have to understand that often hockey and other things in our society are just metaphors for the way people are feeling threatened by the way the world is changing, and not everyone is equipped to adapt to that. So it was frightening to me when I got so many notes where they were threatening my grandchildren. And it really shows you just how our world needs more humanity.
So we have a question coming here. Sports teams have uniquely strong connections to local communities. How is change driven in both directions, team to city and city to team? So whether this is growth or inclusion or modeling or employment or demonstrating humanity, what connections have you seen both in, you said hockey is metaphor. Hockey is so important in the places where it is.
Yeah.
It plays such a powerful role. But then also you're learning from the local team. You have to absorb and adapt in some way.
The biggest aha moment for me taking on this role and spending time in the local markets, and then the first 2 years that I was in the NHL, I visited 28 of the clubs. So literally I was on the road nonstop, because I believe in order for you to understand the problem, you have to be in the local market and touch and feel what their experience is. The biggest aha for me was, it wasn't that clubs and the people in the clubs were resistant. It was that they didn't know how. They didn't know how. They didn't know how to engage with new communities. They didn't know how to build new marketing plans. They didn't know how to position the argument to new sponsors. They needed help in the development of a new approach, a new way of thinking, a new way of doing. And that is something you can work with, right? Everyone assumes that hockey is just so antiquated and, everybody is just, there's no teeth and, and everybody is fighting
all the time.
And it's like we have to dispel some of these false narratives. There's less fighting in hockey now than ever. It's more speed and precision on the ice. The young folks coming along, first of all, something like 67% of the hockey players today are under the age of 25, right? And this is the future of hockey, on and off the ice. We have to do a better job of getting the message out that this is what we are about, and that is in large part, the hockey media is very traditional. We don't control the hockey media. And so I've said to the executive team, we need to get off Hockey Channel. We need to start getting our story outside of hockey so that people understand who we are. And we're making some strides toward that.
I want to go back to the thing you said about giving the local school, the local teams tools to work with. That it may not be that they're opposed to the work, they just don't know how to do it.
Yes.
And again, we all work in organizations, most people that are distributed in some way. Are there any themes that you've come across as you've tried to equip these local teams to do the work? Are there priorities or points of emphasis as you've tried to build tools and give tools to people who are doing the work?
Yeah. One is getting them to build relationships in their local markets beyond the traditional relationships that they've always had. As neighborhoods and their markets have changed, as demographics have moved and shifted, they have not necessarily shifted and moved with that because most of the people that work in the clubs have been there on average for 20, 25 years. And so I think bringing in new talent, fresh thinking from outside of hockey, people that, like myself, who had no preconceived notions about the sport and how the business of the sport is run, people that came from other industries where best practices in some of these areas prevail. I think that's what we've been doing, and we made a lot of progress with, I would say, at least 13 to 14 of the clubs who have taken that advice and moved in that direction.
There's a question from the audience that's relevant to this. The question begins, history is a strong asset in sports, a franchise's history, the league's history. How do you work within the history and also evolve things? The strategy you just talked about is very much about new perspectives, doing things different, bringing in people who don't know the history. So have you experienced that tension, and how do you think about reconciling that tension?
Yes, but I would say that people in hockey are very tribal. It's a tribal sport. When you are part of the tribe, you are so embraced and so welcomed and so integrated. And when I was a consultant to the NHL, and that was my observation, I said, one of the things we want to do is we don't want to abandon that. What we want to do is open up the tribe so more people can feel like they're part of it. And that resonates with people who have been in hockey and in hockey culture forever, because they pride themselves on that tribal culture. So that's been a bridge. This idea that we're not saying culture was bad. What we're saying is the world is changing and we have to enhance the culture. So how do we take the best of what we have and enhance it by what we know the future is going to require us to do? And I'm not saying everybody agrees with that now, but I would say more people agree with it that don't. And I probably would say that more people than the outside world would say agree with it.
Okay. Let's talk just a touch more about data side of things. I know, well, hold on. We have a question here that comes back to one of the bigger words that you've used. And so the question is, which internal initiatives were especially effective or not with spreading humanity? Especially regarding polarization of employees and clubs.
Yeah. So 2 years ago, maybe, right around and after COVID, I convinced the commissioner to have every employee, from the commissioner all the way down to the person in the mailroom, to go through a 2-day learning experience around leadership and inclusion and culture. 2 days. And
what did you call the workshop? What did you tell them it was about?
Leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah. And we brought in an organization from Portland, Oregon, a guy that I'd worked with, Bill Proudman. And the name of the organization is White Men as Full Diversity Partners. That has been in existence for 30 years. I thought Bill and his team were the perfect people to lead this leadership experience because they look at leadership through the lens of those that are currently in power, white men, and they frame it so that white men don't feel like they're left out of this conversation about change and growth. So every employee went through this 2-day experience, and I believe that it was transformative for our culture because post that, we set up these learning pods where groups of 3 to 4 employees could spend time delving and having more authentic conversations about what the 2-day experience was with senior leaders in the organization, including Gary. And the commissioner is probably one of the few executives that has 2 years later continued to have those sessions with his pod, because he says he learns a lot from the young folks that are part of his pod. So I think that that experience opened our culture up to thinking differently and acting differently.
Kim, one might reasonably be suspicious of the success of a program that is mandated for all employees. What do you think allowed that one to work? And you've been involved with lots of training, lots of consulting. How, when we want to expose everybody to something, but we know that there's some risk whenever we force people to do things. What allowed that to work? What advice do you have?
I think for us, for that experience, it was timing.
Timing.
Yes. I think that we were coming off of COVID, coming off of the experience of George Floyd's murder. I think people were willing to be vulnerable and talk about what they were feeling. And we capitalized on that moment. I'm not a big supporter of forced training at all. I don't think that it works long term. I don't think it has organizational impact. But we were at a moment in the culture and in a moment in our society where that experience could be transformative for us. Now, there are people that still don't agree and don't get it. But I said earlier, you've got to run with the horses that are ready to run. You're never going to have 100%. If we seek perfection, we're going to always be disappointed. But I would say we've got 80% of the organization that are willing to be listeners and learners. And I'll take it. And we are running with that imperfection. So the last question, data crowd. You mentioned in one of our previous conversations that the NHL had hired a new chief of marketing. A year before I came.
A year before you got.
Yeah.
So you guys were kind of leaders in making this transformation. But that Silicon Valley data-oriented marketing leader that has now infused the NHL with this analytics orientation. Where do you see that making a difference? How is that making a difference in your work?
Yeah, so those of you that don't know her, you should know her. Heidi Browning, who's the chief marketing officer at the NHL, and Heidi joined the league a year before I did. We are the only 2 women on the senior executive leadership team. And Heidi, as you said, came from Silicon Valley, and she has brought a discipline and an orientation toward data and analytics to the NHL and to the NHL teams. When Heidi joined 7 years ago, I don't think maybe 1 or 2 clubs even knew what data analytics was, and they surely didn't have data analytics teams. Now, 3/4 of the clubs have full data analytics teams that are helping them understand and analyze ticketing and helping them understand and analyze sponsorships and integrating all of this demographic work and aligning it with culture and change. So it is a muscle that the NHL has been strengthening under Heidi's leadership. It is a priority at the executive table and with the Board of Governors, which are the owners, because many of these owners, their broader sets of businesses are being driven and led through data and analytics. So, you know, you look at a Ted Leonsis who owns the Capitals, and you look at a Larry Tannenbaum. They are at the forefront of change in this space. And many of them have tech companies in their portfolios.
Well, Kim, we are at time. We need to help bring an end to the entire conference, but thank you very much for being here. We appreciate greatly the work that you're doing. We look forward to seeing more of it down the road and appreciate your sharing your thoughts on it today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.